So tell me about anarchism as a political ideology.
Well, I think anarchism's unique because it's sort of been excluded from the main canon of political thought, particularly in the Western discourse. It was a very viable, at least it had a mass following, but now in our contemporary history of political thought, it's sort of really been pushed to the periphery. It's sort of the nutcases that really spend a lot of time thinking about it, except there are some very interesting thinkers that have given it serious consideration. Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Bertrand Russell seriously looked at it in Roads to Freedom. But it's a very rich tradition, and I think the task of political theory these days should be, in some sense, to try to recover the lost position of anarchism.
So what do you think has been responsible for the alienation of anarchy from the Western discourse and political philosophy?
I would say that there are a couple of factors involved in that. One, the most obvious, particularly in the American discourse, is just media portrayal of it. That the word anarchy has been misused and abused so badly that it's often associated with anything to do with bomb-throwing terrorist nutcases, when probably the majority of anarchists advocate a lot of peaceful means, solely, exclusively peaceful means for reforming and reordering society into a form of libertarian socialism. And I think the point that it is a strand of socialist thought brings out another way that it's sort of slipped to the wayside in our discourse, and that's probably that hardline Marxists have sort of marginalized it. If you look at Lenin and the way he took a very proactive role in shaping socialist ideas in really the eastern half of the world, Eastern Europe, all the way over, I think it's just sort of been forgotten, more or less. But there was certainly, it had its heyday, probably culminating in the Spanish Civil War of 1936, when the vast majority of the anti-fascist movement was composed of anarchist syndicates, and it had a big influence in Russia, in Germany in the late 1800s. What were we talking about again?
Well, we can move on. So, in your terms, what does an anarchist want?
That varies. There are some, on the outskirts, you have some people who call themselves anarcho-capitalists, but any traditional anarchist is going to pretty much not look at that as really a legitimate form of anarchism, simply because it didn't spring from the same intellectual tradition. It's sort of like libertarianism taken to its conclusion, as it were. But if you look at the traditional anarchists, starting with Godwin, but really with Proudhon, with Bakunin, with Peter Kropotkin, Rudolf Rocker, Emma Goldman, the big names in anarchism, the sorts of, and Daniel Gurin, a really important guy in the 60s that sort of drew together a lot of this history and put them all into context. More or less what they are advocating is a society without coercion. And that they really emphasize, Gurin brings this out very well, that society is an ordering force much more important than the legal statutes that structure a government, that the main thing that drives human action is society, and it's a viable replacement for government. And furthermore, that society will be directed in a way that no longer distributes goods on the basis of a market system. Things are it's a much more equitable system, and that's where you start to see some divergence in anarchist goals, and you also have some divergence in their means, from anarcho-syndicalists that advocate a general strike to people like Bakunin who might advocate something a little bit more like violent revolution. But if you look at Kropotkin, he was an anarcho-communist. He had this theory that I think he was roughly building off of Marx's theory of value. That basically, if you look at capital, if you look at any sort of machines that are used to produce goods, there's absolutely no way to properly value those because someone invented them. You can't look at the raw materials. You have to look at how human intellect has shaped the natural world, and it becomes impossible to calculate when you extrapolate that principle back through history. And so, since it's impossible to value anything, you have to communistically distribute things. There are also collectivists. There are a number of other schemes for distributing goods, but generally in this orthodox strand of libertarian socialism that is thought of as anarchism, it's going to be on some sort of basis of need. It's a egalitarian philosophy at its core.
So there is a concern that many people would express that such a philosophy is impractical. How would you react to that?
That's a very common charge, that it's utopian, it's against human nature. And to that I would simply reply that our ideas of human nature are so narrow in the current state of affairs. If you look at, the discourses, you're going to be advocating capitalism and markets as the only, and governments as a viable alternative for organizing society. But if you look at human history, and I think Poliani was really good at taking this, showing this concept, capitalism is a very new phenomenon, and governments and hierarchical structure is a very new phenomenon. In the long run of human history, things were presumably ordered, fairly well. That being said, there's potentiality for a lot more order. You don't have to be like an anarcho-primitivist and sort of tear everything down. The Luddite conception is probably a bit dangerous considering the population spread of the earth right now. We absolutely need technology, but the key is, and Chomsky's mentioned this before, we have to focus technology in a direction not to maximize profit, but make life more, quality of life better. You can take Marx's concept of alienation and sort of really flesh it out in the anarchist scheme way beyond just the worker alienated from his product, worker alienated from society as a whole by that coercive hierarchical structure of government.
It's almost done.
Well, everybody, I hope you enjoyed my discussion on anarchism.